Alrighty, thank you everyone for joining us at the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad right now to be joined by Brian Becker, the National Director of the Answer Coalition, that's Act Now to Stop War and End Racism. He's the founding member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, PSL, and host of the Socialist Program. Brian, thanks so much for joining us.
Great pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So Answer is organizing an event on March 18th, the Peace in Ukraine Stop NATO action in Washington, D.C. And NATO and the war in Ukraine is a topic that we've discussed on the show before. The importance of contextualizing what's going on in Ukraine by understanding the history and the present of U.S. imperialism and aggression, which in this case includes the multinational arm of U.S. imperialism, NATO, formed to basically be the political equivalent of a very drunk guy at a bar desperately trying to pick a fight with a Russian. And I wanted to start off by highlighting that this event also coincides with the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And I think a lot of folks listening or hearing about this might think, wait, that's over, isn't it? Why does that matter? And what's that got to do with Ukraine? So, Brian, starting us off there, how would you respond to that?
Right. Thank you so much. It's the Answer Coalition initiated this demonstration along with a couple of other groups, but it's not simply the Answer Coalition. This is 100 organizations have come together at this point and are building a broad coalition to march together on the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War to say, we're not going to forget the Iraq War. This was a landmark event. It was a criminal shock and awe invasion. Those were the words of the war makers. They wanted to shock and awe the Iraqi people with their capacity to impose violence and terror on all of Iraq society. Hundreds of thousands, maybe more than 1 million died. According to the Lancet Medical Journal, they didn't all die because of bombs and bullets. Many died because they couldn't get drinkable water. They couldn't get medicine. They were made into refugees. But hundreds of thousands of civilians died. And the war was premised and pretexted on lies. The idea that Iraq somehow threatened other countries at that point, that it was building weapons of mass destruction, all of that was BS. All of that was a lie. BS meaning, of course, bad sociology. And here we are 20 years later. The perpetrators, the architects of that war, George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, they're going around making speeches, writing books, making lots of money, and joining the chorus condemning Russia for invading another country. And George W. Bush has been explicit. He's like, we can't allow any country to invade a non-belligerent, to invade a peaceful neighbor. And he actually, because he's George W. Bush and is such an idiot, he misspoke. And he said, no one can, like the war in Iraq, meaning they said, oh, I mean the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, that was amazing.
It's confusion. But, what we're saying, and the reason we picked this date is not only to remember Iraq, but we believe that the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War that came right before it, that was October 7th, 2001. The Yugoslav War, where U.S. and NATO dropped 28,000 bombs in a 4-month period on Yugoslavia. Then the war against Libya, the NATO destruction of the Gaddafi government, the proxy war against Syria, the Israeli nonstop war against Palestinian people, that these are not separate and segmented events, but part of a global war drive orchestrated by the United States. And the Ukraine war, while the Americans are not directly fighting that war, they're providing all the weapons for Ukraine, the financing for Ukraine. Obviously, Ukraine's successes on the battlefields were a byproduct of U.S. technology, U.S. weapons, and also U.S. covert and intelligence operations, such that the U.S. is actually the commanding force of a war where Ukrainians and Russians are dying. So we're making the argument that the war in Ukraine isn't simply and shouldn't be perceived simply as a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but part of a global US war drive whereby the US is at war with Russia, using Ukraine as a proxy. And the US is also preparing to go to war against China. So we're saying it's incumbent on the people of the United States to remember the crimes of Iraq, but not to segment the Iraq war as something different, like an anomaly, but rather part and parcel of this US war drive. So unless we speak up and say no to the war drive, unless we speak up and say, why spend $1 trillion a year, which is about what the US now spends for death and destruction in the name of defense, instead of spending that on things human beings actually need, unless we do that, it appears to the rest of the world that we agree with the US government. So we feel it's incumbent on the people in the United States, if we don't agree with this foreign policy, if we don't agree with the US global war drive, to speak up, speak out, and be visible and be loud. And so that's why we're gathering together on March 18th.
Thank you, Brian, for connecting those. And kind of in the same vein of connecting issues and not segmenting them, as you mentioned, I saw that in the organizing for March 18th, there are several contingents that are being highlighted. For instance, arts and cultural workers, climate crisis and militarism, veterans and GIs. And we've also talked on the show, for instance, how climate is linked to war, the US military being the single largest polluter in the world, equal to 140 countries in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. But there's this struggle to connect issues to war. And I can speak personally that something that I have come into contact with is people are like, oh, well, that's just happening over there. And what does that have to do with my ability to buy food or to get a better job or things like that? So how can we do a better job of connecting all of the issues that happen in our daily lives to the issues of war and imperialism?
Yeah, because the United States government, the capitalist system here, the economic system, is really addicted to militarism and war spending, which incentivizes war itself. And that's been true since 1950. Didn't used to be true. At the end of wars, up until and even after World War II, when wars came to an end, the US demilitarized, demobilized, converted war economies to civilian economies. But we reached a stage in capitalism after the depression of the 1930s, where I think the capitalists decided we can't really stabilize this economy on either domestically or internationally without lots of war spending. So there was the creation of the military industrial complex, something very new, something that didn't exist as a permanent feature of the economy. But that started in 1950. So that was, 73 years ago now. But, here, when you look at that 73-year period, the US has been at war after war after war. There was Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, the other wars I mentioned. And whenever US troops went abroad, giant anti-war movements started. The Vietnam War created this almost like a political civil war inside the United States. The Iraq War, even before the war started, we, the Answer Coalition and others, but principally our organization, we were organizing hundreds of thousands of people every month, not like once a year or once every couple of years. Every month that was happening because the American people didn't want to go to war in Iraq. They didn't want to have a repeat of Vietnam. So what's happened now, and this is the sort of insidious, diabolical character of a system addicted to war, is the US government has decided, let's have other people do all the bleeding. Let's have other people, not Americans, do all the suffering. So we have the emergence now of new sort of hybrid warfare methodologies directly constructed, not because they're more powerful, but to keep the American people on the sidelines, to keep them out of the political fray, to make them feel that they don't understand the war, but it doesn't really impact them. And so we have drone strikes that are going on every day, targeted assassinations, economic sanctions that are kind of a slow motion genocide against poor countries, proxy wars like the war in Ukraine. All of these tactics, I believe, have been deliberately, calculatingly developed so that the American people actually don't feel engaged in the wars being conducted by a government that speaks in their name. And that's what makes it more complicated. If Biden were to say tomorrow, or if Trump, had said, or if he becomes president again, or if DeSantis becomes president, if any president says, look, we're going to send hundreds of thousands of troops to Ukraine because the Russians are so bad, we have to fight them. And please send your 18 and 19-year-old son and some of your daughters. We're going to go fight this Russian aggressor on the battlefields in Ukraine. That millions of Americans would start to join the anti-war movement because they would feel the immediacy of the war, and they would say, what is this about? Are we really going to war? Am I going to have my son or my daughter die for Taiwan or for the Donbass? No. So we have this problem in the anti-war movement, which is this shielding of the American people from the terribleness of the wars that the government is committing. So what we're trying to do is, and we've sort of, as you can see the literature, it says our demand is fund human needs, not the war machine. One, there is a war machine. There is, as I said, a global US war drive. And right now, Eleanor, half the people who are declaring bankruptcy in the United States, it's because they can't pay their doctor's bills. There's a wave of evictions taking place all around the country. There was a major article in the Wall Street Journal today about millennials, people in their 30s, not able to really make ends meet. Even people who are making $60,000, $70,000 and who have two parents in a family, they can't make ends meet because between rent and student debt that just doesn't go away, they're having a hard time surviving. But meanwhile, the military-industrial complex is like these vultures, devouring the national treasury. And it's all done in the name of defense. It's never like we're going to war, we're committing wars of aggression or anything like that. So we're trying to make the connection and show the people, absent a direct intervention of US military forces that would in fact catalyze an anti-war movement, that there is a heavy price that's being paid by the US working class because we're financing these wars, and these are rich man's wars, and they're not for us. They're not for the people, the targets. They're really for the military industrial complex, for the capitalist class. That's a harder argument to make than if our sons and daughters are in fact being killed right now, but that's the argument we're making.
Absolutely, and all very good points. And I'm curious in terms of, the sons and daughters, or the actual real threat to American lives. Going after Russia and China is not going after Iraq and Afghanistan. These are superpowers now at this point. And particularly China. Our entire economy in the US rests on China's shoulders, either because they own our debt or because so much of manufacturing is in China. And I'm curious, I'm reminded here of a Hedges quote. Chris Hedges said, for the US, if you speak to the world in a language of violence, don't be surprised if they eventually speak back in that same language. What do you feel is the likelihood of not just a proxy war, but an actual war between Russia, China, and the U.S., or something of that similarity? And is that an actual threat, do you feel, and that's something that should be organized around?
Yes, I think that's exactly where we're going. Part of our demands on March 18th is not only to end the war in Ukraine rather than allow it to escalate, which brings the U.S. and Russia directly into a potential military confrontation. And both sides have thousands of nuclear weapons. Each U.S. submarine, Trident submarine, there's 12 of them. Each one has the military capacity to destroy simultaneously 120 cities with multiple independently targeted nuclear warheads. Each submarine, just this one submarine, can take out 120 cities. If the U.S. ends up at war with Russia, which I think the U.S. is trying to avoid and have it simply be a proxy war, but the efforts lead in the direction of escalation and towards global conflict. This is going to happen. And I think it's even more likely, and I think the U.S. is actively preparing for a war with China. And it seems kind of breathtaking, like war with China. I mean, 1 out of every 5 humans in the world is Chinese. China's a growing economy. It's a growing military. It's not trying to create military bases around the world. It's not trying to go to war. It's not sort of provoking the US and, let's say, promoting Hawaiian independence the way US is promoting Taiwanese independence. It's not doing, even though Hawaii is a lot farther from the US mainland than Taiwan is from the Chinese mainland. China's not doing that, but China's obviously preparing for war. They're reorganizing big parts of even the internet, even the legal system in China in preparation for military conflict. And what the US intends, I think, in the case of China, is to confront China in the South China and East China Sea. There's the first island nations that are, sort of ringing the eastern part of China in the Pacific. Those are, the US is trying to turn them into military vassals, like an extension of American military power, setting up the newest, highest, form of technology, including hypersonic weapons that go 5 times the speed of sound. What the US calculation is that they're going to confront China in the Pacific, and that China won't risk thermonuclear war with the United States, which would obviously annihilate both sides, that China will back down, and that the US will be able to contain China, limit China, and show China its own weakness to itself, as Reagan was basically doing with the USSR when they ringed the Soviet Union with intermediate range missiles in 1981 and 82, missiles that had a flight time of 6 minutes to their targets. And they targeted every Russian political office, not military offices only, every political office, every local office of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was targeted with 6-minute range missiles that would, of course, destroy the office and the surrounding area. The US feels that, as happened in the Soviet Union, that pressure cooker that was created on the Soviet Union caused the Soviet Union to implode, which actually did happen within a few years. And I think the US is trying to do the same thing with China, say, we're going to have a conflict with you. It's going to be in your neighborhood. It's going to use these advanced missiles. And don't you dare try to come at us directly, because we can annihilate you. We have 5,000 operational nuclear weapons. So this game of nuclear chicken, this gratuitous, unnecessary, provocative game of major power conflict, which is the established and now accepted doctrine of the Pentagon starting in 2018, this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you gird for international global war, major power conflict, if you play chicken constantly, if you carry out contingency planning in somebody else's own backyard, whether it's Ukraine for Russia or Taiwan and the East China Sea for the case of China, something's going to happen. And the recklessness of this is breathtaking. And again, the American people have to think, why? Russia's not marching on us. China's not about to do this. Why are we in this hyper aggressive mode? And, I think that's a complex question. I mean, you have rich kids running the State Department, like Blinken, they've just rich kids who have never had or wanted or suffered anything, don't know anything. They're just privileged people. And they spin out all of these war game plans, and they think that everybody else will kneel or finally genuflect or capitulate. So there's rich people running the show. There's the corporations that are making tons of money off of this. And then you have the media, which the media is, in a way, the mainstream media, even what the right wing calls the liberal media or the liberal calls the right wing media. Both of them are equally insane when it comes to promoting war, and so insane that if any politician says, well, wait, like Biden started to say right before before Russia invaded Ukraine, he said, well, we'll have to see about whether there will be a complete 100% retaliation. Depends what they do. In other words, Biden was kind of saying, well, we have to wait and see how this plays out. He was condemned for being a capitulationist to Putin. And then he immediately changed his tone. He was like, no, we're going to destroy Nord Stream 2 and we're going to do this. And, all of these weak politicians faced with this hysteria, this war hysteria, which has become a consensus, they're not going to stand up and say no. They're going to say, I'd rather keep my job and my political career by going along with the war hysteria rather than stopping it. So this is, when you look at Congress, Eleanor, the people who used to be called the liberals during the Vietnam War, who were ban the bomb, better relations with the Soviet Union, don't go to war in the third world, those people are either silent or going along with the new war drive. And then you have the old hawks, which are the dominant part of Congress on both sides of the aisle, and they're like vociferous cheerleaders for it. You have 110 bills in Congress right now against China. Like all the Congress people are competing with each other to see who can be more anti-China. So that's the danger right now of American politics.
Yeah, very, very dangerous indeed. And I think I mean, the most anti-war person that I can think of is Barbara Lee, who just brought up a bill to take $100 billion from the Pentagon budget a year, which is really nothing when you consider that it's over $1 trillion. And that's our anti-war person. I mean, I can't imagine her saying ban the bomb or let's get rid of nuclear weapons or anything like that. And I am curious as well with regards, I mean, you mentioned a lot about what's going on with China, and it does seem with regards to Ukraine and Russia that the US is trying to backpedal a little bit. Like I've seen some headlines even in mainstream media that say things like, well, Ukraine is going to have to, finish this in the field. Like we've done what we can and things like that. Now that, we've sold Ukraine on Wall Street. And I'm curious, do you think that that's actually that the US is really trying to get out of this because they realize, oh, this is not what I thought it was? And what do you foresee being that plan? Particularly, you mentioned DeSantis, who, if folks are unaware, I recently did an interview with Mike Preisner about DeSantis and his history in the military and how he really is a terrifying potential for president. Looking at where US politics are now, what do you see as the likelihood of us actually moving away from this proxy war in the now or particularly in the coming years with the presidential election coming up?
Yeah, really important question. And a lot of people are discussing this. I personally, I don't believe the US is interested in negotiations at all. I think the talk of negotiations and the idea of the sort of the floating of like, doesn't the war have to end sometime and won't there need to be a negotiated settlement? I think this is essentially being organized to placate European leaders like Macron and the Germans, who are under a lot of pressure from their own people to end the war. I talked to a guy in Italy this morning. He's an American living in Italy. He lives in this solar panel house. His electric bill went up in the last month by a factor of 4. So if you're paying $200 a month, he's now paying $800 a month for an electric bill. This is impacting Europe. And I think the US is absolutely committed to not having negotiations. I think this is all a ruse. And the Macron is meeting with the Chinese. The Germans and the French are obviously looking for a way out. The US has to sort of placate them by saying, yeah, we want negotiations too. We're really committed to it. The war has to end sometime, but this is all just a way of not losing France and losing Germany and having them defect to becoming an opposition to the US proxy war. So I don't take it seriously at all. There is no real effort because the US is quite happy about what's going on. The arms manufacturers are making lots of money. The US there's no political blowback yet at home. And I don't see one. I mean, we're doing the best we can, like this March 18th mass mobilization. And we're going to keep doing that because we think it's one of the most important issues and connected, as I said, to all of the other important issues. But I don't believe there's going to be negotiations. I think maybe fake negotiations. And Zelensky, owes his, Ukraine was a politically complicated place. Probably half the country wanted to remain neutral. And there were many Ukrainian political leaders and political parties that favored better relations with Russia, which doesn't mean that they didn't want to also have good relations with Europe. But they were sort of like the Yanukovych type forces. But they weren't, Yanukovych wasn't alone. Those guys are in jail now. Those political parties have been banned. Those politicians have been either silenced, imprisoned, or have fled. So Zelensky is in a political situation where he owes his survival now politically to the American war effort. And inside the country, I mean, Putin said part of the goal of the Russian invasion was to denazify Ukraine. Well, from my point of view, Nazification has increased as a consequence of the war, because the Azov battalion and these other forces who maybe represented 10% of the population before, they're now considered like national heroes. So if that was one of the objectives of the Russians, that objective was not met at all. I mean, protecting people in Donbass, okay, you can make that argument. But Zelensky and the political climate in Ukraine is so right-wing now, and I think 100% Zelensky can't be independent from the U.S., and the U.S. wants the war effort. So talk of negotiations is to placate European public opinion, and also maybe to placate that part of Ukrainian public opinion that wants the war to end, is dying for the war to end. And people who don't live in the Donbass, if your city is being bombed or your kids are being sent to be killed, maybe you come to a conclusion at some point like, forget the Donbass, let's end this damn war. The U.S. doesn't want that public opinion to start to percolate. So it's kind of like stringing people along with the promise of negotiations when I think there's no intention for negotiations. I could be wrong. I don't have a crystal ball, but that's my sense of things.
Well, I hope you're wrong, Brian, but I don't feel that you are.
Yeah, I hope I'm wrong too.
But finally here, coming back to March 18th, I just to play devil's advocate here, because this is something that has been thrown at me before too, particularly when I was getting into organizing just before the Iraq War in 2002 and 2003, was, well, and also after, when people pointed out, well, they invaded anyway. So what good were the marches? What good was the organizing? They didn't listen to you. They don't care. It doesn't shift the levers of power. What would you say with regards to that in terms of continuing the anti-war organizing?
Well, that's what we were told during the Vietnam War. I'm old enough now, and I was young enough then to be in part of the anti-war movement in 1969 and 1970. And people would say, look, the war just drags on and on and on. And it was true. I mean, there were like millions of Americans were coming into the streets, and the war just kept going. But a couple of things happened. One was, because of public opinion, the U.S. couldn't do what it needed to do to win the war in Vietnam, which is to escalate the war. Okay. Escalation would have led to actual civil war in the United States. So public opinion had shifted. Secondly, the anti-war opinion moved into the military, and rank and file soldiers stopped fighting. They wouldn't fight. They started resisting. That's one of the reasons they got rid of the draft, was to not have a repeat performance of conscripts rebelling. But obviously public opinion mattered. I don't know. I think you'll remember, Eleanor, that in end of August, early September 2013, Obama was under extreme pressure to for a wider war against Syria, because John Kerry and the Washington Post and the others said Assad crossed red lines, he used chemical weapons. Obama had said, as long as he doesn't use chemical weapons, which is a red line, we won't go to war. And then suddenly Assad decided to use the one thing that would cross the red line. I mean, it was obviously a fraud. It was a hoax. But John Kerry was devoted to it. The Washington Post was devoted to it. But American public opinion was not for another war in Iraq, in the Middle East, like the Iraq War. And same in Britain. The House of Commons voted no. They said, the U.S. goes to war in Syria, we're not going with them. So the U.S. lost Britain, its primary ally, because of British anti-war public opinion. In the United States, Congress was getting calls 300 to 1, people against, like, no, don't do this. So the idea that public opinion doesn't matter or mobilized public opinion doesn't matter is in fact not true. You can go through American history over and over again, but it doesn't mean that public opinion is always strong enough, say, to stop a war before it starts. We had hundreds of thousands, millions actually demonstrating before March 19, 2003. The US went to war. Now, they say afterwards, see, you didn't stop the war happened, and so wasn't it all meaningless? Well, what was it about that war that allowed Bush to get away with it? The war lasted 3 weeks. What if the war had, after 3 weeks, the Baghdad government fled, Saddam was on, and Bush got on the aircraft carrier and said, mission accomplished, we did it, because the war was over. So it looked like he won. But then the resistance in Iraq started to grow. And, more and more Americans started dying in Iraq. Fallujah happened, all of these struggles happened. And by 2005, we had 350,000 people back in the streets in Washington. And from then on, the whole purpose of the US foreign policy was how to get out of Iraq. And one of the reasons Obama won was he said, we're going to get out of Iraq. Remember, that seemed like a big change. Then, of course, because the Iraq war had destroyed Iraqi society, it gave room for ISIS to grow. And that became the basis for the US to re-enter Iraq. But it can't really re-enter Iraq in the same way. The US could never send tens of thousands more troops right now to Iraq. The American people wouldn't stand for it. And so Iraq is actually gravitating in the direction of Iran geostrategically. The whole thing was a kind of a big flop for US imperialism. Terrible for the people in Iraq, but a flop for US imperialism. But US imperialism was constrained by public opinion, and public opinion matters. It doesn't always matter exactly in the same ways, but the one thing we know for sure is if we don't organize public opinion, if we remain silent, if we say, look, all is lost and social change is impossible, we know that the war makers win. We know that the capitalists win. We know that real progress doesn't win. Progress and peace or social justice only happens when people fight. Does it mean we always win? No. Does it mean that success is guaranteed? No. But we know for sure that no change will happen unless we make it happen. Change indeed comes from below. That's the spirit of the Answer Coalition. That's how we organize. And we believe, if you look at American history, in spite of all odds, when real, actual progressive change does happen, it's because of those social and political forces who have been brought together, the people who kind of don't give up. And at a certain moment, they're not giving up, allows a bigger space to be filled by millions of people who indeed do make the change happen. So that's how we view it March 18th. We urge people, come to Washington, D.C. If you're on the West, go to a San Francisco or LA demo. Don't give up. Don't give up on peace, and don't let the war makers win.
Very well put. Thank you, Brian, so much for that. And yes, well, where can people go to find out more and to get involved with this?
Well, answercoalition.org is our website. You can look for Answer Coalition on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and TikTok. As you mentioned, Eleanor, there's going to be a large veterans contingent, an environmental contingent, cultural and art workers. I feel like it's not going to be like millions of people, but it's going to be significant. And it's the starting over after a year where the entire explanation of the Ukraine war was Russia's bad, Russia's the aggressor, Russia's the invader, the Americans are carrying out a noble cause. People are starting to wake up and starting to see that that's not the whole story. As a matter of fact, if the U.S. had wanted a negotiated settlement, one was easily at hand. The U.S. government cynically turned its back on that, refused that. But we, the people of the United States, and almost all people want peace. We can overcome that, but only, again, if we organize. Answercoalition.org.
Thank you so much, Brian. Yes, absolutely. People across the globe, the 99%, to do a callback to 2011, have much more in common than we do with our respective governments. So answercoalition.org. Please, folks, check that out. Brian, thank you so much for joining us on Project Censored.
Great. Thanks so much for having us.